In this video we're going to look at how to pick up stitches when knitting a top-down sweater. So here are my stitches that I've saved previously and placed on hold. I've put a needle on that cable. You can also use waste yarn to hold that, but I'm going to pinch the underarm here to find the center stitch, and I'll start here in picking up my stitches under the arm. So I go through both legs of these backward loop cast on stitches that we made previously, and I'll take my working yarn and pull a loop through, and that is called pick up and knit. So pulling the loop through is actually called the knitting part, but here's pick up and knit. So you go through underneath both legs of that stitch to pick up and pull the yarn through to knit, and I'm just following my pattern. My pattern says that I need 6 stitches from the center of the underarm, and I'm going to do 5 until I get to this place where you're sometimes going to get a little hole in the underarm of your sweater, so you're going to need to use a special technique to minimize that gapping. And that's because these 2 stitches you just watched me tug on are kind of stretching out when you've placed stitches on hold. So to knit my 6th stitch here, you saw I went under the 2 legs of the stitch just like I normally do, and I'm going to take this bar from the stretched out stitch next door, and I'm going to twist it and knit it behind my 6th stitch that I'm picking up and knitting. So I'm placing both on the needle, both my original picked up stitch and that bar from the stretched out stitch, and then I'm twisting that bar behind the stitch and knitting together through the back loop to do that. And that has taken some of the slack out of this bar that's stretched out between the stitches, and we're going to go one step further and do that over here with this bar as well. I'm placing that on my left hand needle, putting my left hand needle through from back to front, and now I'm going to knit the next stitch from my saved stitches together with this bar, and I'm knitting through the front loop with this because this will twist that bar that is on the needle behind my stitch. So there you go, we've twisted the bar from the stretched out stitch behind these 2 stitches to kind of minimize that gap in the corner of the underarm. And now I'm just going to knit all the way around, knitting each of my stitches that I have on hold until I get to the last stitch, and then I'll show you how to do this on the other side. So I'm going to slip this stitch purlwise over to my right hand needle while I pick up the bar next to it from the stretched out stitch, and then you saw that I twisted the stitch to be oriented backwards so that I can essentially do a slip slip knit here, and that twisted that bar that is in the stretched out stitch beside my saved stitches and allowed that last stitch that I saved to lie flat on top of it. Now I'm going to pick up the next bar between the stretched out stitches, and I want this to go behind my next picked up stitch from the underarm. So you saw I just used my right needle to help my left one. So I used my left needle to go under to pick up a stitch where I normally would, and I've placed that bar behind it on my needle, and now I'm knitting through the front. So you just need to make sure when you're knitting these together you catch all the strands of yarn and go right through the center so that you make sure that you are getting all those loops together when you knit these stitches together. Then I'm just going to pick up and knit to the center of the underarm to complete the stitches for my sleeve. And I need one more here, but you can see if I put one more right here that I'm actually sharing the same hole as my first stitch, so I'm just gonna backtrack a little bit here and pick up kind of through the center of that stitch below. So there you have it. I have all my stitches picked up, and I'll go ahead and knit a couple of rounds so you can see what that will look like when you're finished. So here's 1 stitch and 2 stitch where I hid that bar behind the stitches to reduce this gap. And you can see just a little bit if you're up close and personal with your knitting and looking for it, but when you're wearing it, you're not going to notice that. And again on the other side, here's where we knit that bar together behind the stitches. Sometimes you still have a little bit of a hole here, and if you feel like you need to tidy things up, you can take some of your yarn from your project and just duplicate stitch through this area, anything that you feel like needs tightening up. So you'd start off to the side of the hole that you want to tighten, and you just follow the trail that the yarn follows when you're stitching, when you're creating this stockinette fabric. So you just kind of take your time and follow the same path that the yarn naturally wants to go in. You're coming up through the center of a stitch and going up underneath the 2 legs of the stitch above, and then coming back down through the center of that same stitch, and then I like to in one motion go into the neighboring stitch as well. But you can just keep doing this until you feel like you've got everything snugged up, and that just provides a little bit more structure in a spot on your sweater that likes to kind of pull hard at your stitches to create those holes. So anyway, that will help minimize holes. You keep going until you feel like you've got things tidied up. And that's one way to do that.